Welcome back to my channel for another execution method video. Last time I covered the electric chair and reached the conclusion that it is potentially the most painful of all modern methods, but today's is a serious rival. As a whole, it causes the most suffering for the longest period. I am talking about the gas chamber. This content will involve graphic depictions of death and may be upsetting to some. Viewer discretion advised. The way that this method was first adopted is pretty unbelievable. All the way back in 1921, the state of Nevada began thinking up different ways to replace the gallows. After watching those executions go so wrong so many times, they knew that they had to find something that would be more humane. My theory on this matter is that they weren't so concerned about truly making it humane, but making it at least appear that way. To be frank, they were tired of traumatizing witnesses. After a few good brainstorming sessions, they arrived at the idea of lethal gas. They began doing a little research to try and gauge what kind of gas would be best. They knew that they needed something readily available, cost-effective, and fairly easy to use. This led them to hydrogen cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide had been used for this and that for some time, but most notably, it was used by France and the US in World War I with decent success. So a couple of years went by and the state was given their very first human guinea pig. Ji John was a member of the Hip Sing Tong Criminal Society and was convicted of murdering an elderly member. He was tried and found guilty right around the time that the state began the process of adopting a new method. By the time his death date approached, they weren't exactly ready, so they opted to fake it until they made it. They had no chamber and no protocol. Somewhere along the road, someone came up with the ridiculous idea to just gas him in his cell while he slept. He was not given a heads up. It was meant to be a complete surprise. In their minds, it would be more humane if he didn't see it coming, which makes sense to some degree. So one night while John was fast asleep, they used a hose to release copious amounts of hydrogen cyanide into his cell. The first problem that they encountered was the fact that this wasn't a cell behind glass. It had bars. The gas went in and then wafted right back out. The next problem was the danger. Because the gas wasn't well contained within an airtight chamber, it put prison employees at risk. It was a complete bust, to say the least. This led everyone back to the drawing board, only now they understood that they needed to construct some form of a chamber. They did just that. They created the very first protocol of the gas chamber. It was put together inside of the prison butcher shop. The next step was for the state to gain possession of enough gas to cause death. This was a little tricky. There was only one company in the Western Hemisphere that could provide enough, only they refused to transport it due to the dangers. So a few prison employees hopped in their vehicles and took a road trip to LA to pick it up themselves. By February 8, 1924, the gas chamber and its contents were ready and waiting to usher John into death. He was strapped into a wooden chair and secured into the 11-foot-long chamber. A tiny window offered a glimpse into the process for witnesses. At 9:40 a.m., a pump sprayed about 4 pounds of hydrocyanic acid, which is a solution of hydrogen cyanide and water. This try came along with its own hiccups. Outside, it was cold and humid and their electric heater failed. This left the chamber at a chilly temp of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The ideal temperature would have been around 75. This caused some of the solution to pool on the floor rather than waft up where John could inhale it. No worries though, because the amount of gas that they released was more than enough. It was actually overkill. John slumped down in the chair and appeared to lose consciousness in just seconds. He continued to slightly bob his head up and down for several minutes, but all in all, it got the job done. Naturally, the process evolved over time. States found more effective ways to set up their chambers, but across the board in the US, hydrogen cyanide was the gas of choice. But was it a good choice? Well, not exactly, not if a humane end is the goal. Nothing illustrates the horrifying effects of this systemic toxin the way that the very botched execution of Jimmy Lee Gray did. Once you hear about this utter nightmare, you might be inclined to feel sorrow for Jimmy Lee Gray. Let me help with that a little. Jimmy Lee Gray was about as bad as it gets. When he was at the young age of just 18 years old, he strangled his 16-year-old girlfriend, Elda Prince, to death. The pair were walking home when they got into an argument. After the fact, he concealed her body near the Colorado River. When Elda didn't return home, her mother reported her missing. What did Jimmy do? He helped with the search. Luckily, police saw right through him and hauled him in for questioning. Jimmy buckled and admitted to what he had done. Here's the thing, though. Jimmy only served 6 years before being paroled and released. Just 2 years later, a 3-year-old girl vanished from the apartment complex where he resided. Witnesses came forward saying that they had spotted her with a man who fit Jimmy's description. He was once again questioned, and he spilled the truth. He had taken the girl into his car, assaulted her, and threw her body in the river. On September 2nd, 1983, Jimmy was scheduled to be executed. He enjoyed his last meal of Mexican food and strawberries paired with a cold glass of milk. He was allowed the company of 5 ministers who brought along their own pizza, as if to have their own little dinner party. Once the witnesses were seated, he was beckoned from his cell and ushered into the small chamber. This chamber was far different from the makeshift version built in a prison butcher shop. It almost appeared like a claustrophobic, bulky safe. It was an intimidating sight. He was asked to take a seat in his death chair and was secured with restraints. They buckled around his waist, chest, arms, and legs. The one thing that appeared to be missing was the restraint designed to keep his head in place. It was something that had been utilized in previous similar executions. Jimmy was read his execution order and offered his last rite. He kept his head down and eyes shut the entire time. It was time to proceed. At 12:12 a.m., the door was shut to the airtight chamber. A window revealed a ticket to the impending show for the about 15 witnesses. Beneath Jimmy's death chair was a pail filled with sulfuric acid. The executioner pulled a lever from outside, which released cyanide crystals into the solution. The reaction was near immediate. When combined, the chemical reaction releases hydrogen cyanide gas into the air. Because it is occurring directly beneath the chair, the plumes rise up and envelope the face and body of the condemned. In just seconds, the bystanders watched Jimmy draw in a labored gasp. This was his first big taste of the poison. It flooded into his mouth, airways, and lungs. His nostrils burned with the pungent aroma of musty, sweet almonds, and his taste buds were singed with the flavor of pure burning. Prisoners are instructed beforehand to take many deep breaths of the gas. It is meant to speed up the process. But when each inhale lights a fire and seems to release pure acid onto your soft tissue, it's pretty difficult as a human to bring yourself to do such a thing. Jimmy began writhing in agony. He struggled hard against his restraints. His face became the hue of a ripe tomato and his jugular vein pumped up and appeared to pulsate before witnesses' eyes. Their jaws were all on the floor. He flailed as hard as he could. It was obvious that he was fighting the urge to breathe or gasp, but it was futile. At one point, it appeared that he resigned to the idea of just drinking it in. He gasped another 10 times in quick succession. But see, this is why hydrogen cyanide is not humane. With each gasp, he was welcoming more and more of it into his body. Sure, it was possibly bringing death closer, but it was also burning him alive from the inside out and vice versa. This gas really does attack a human being systemically. It erodes the flesh, eyes, and lips, but it also wages a war internally. It causes calamity for the cells. It interrupts their ability to even utilize whatever oxygen remains. That means that it is attacking every single organ in the body. Meanwhile, it is also burning a lot of the internal tissue as well. The best comparison that I can make is that it is as if you are swallowing and aspirating acid, all while being lit on fire externally. That fire starts off somewhat contained, but the longer the exposure continues, the hotter and more furious it grows. Before you know it, it feels like you are being consumed by licking white flames. Only, unlike being lit on fire, it isn't going to shut down your nerves. It isn't truly burning you that deeply. Once a person obtains third-degree burns or more, the nerves aren't operating at full capacity any longer. The pain dulls a little. That isn't the case here. For every single witness in the room before him, his misery was tangible. They could sense it in his movement and face. It screamed from his clenched fists, bulging veins, and reddened eyes. After the 11 total gasps escaped from Jimmy's mouth, he began moaning. They were moans unlike those of the living, unlike those who are not on the precipice of death. They were guttural and animalistic. They crescendoed into a wail. Believe it or not, this wasn't even the worst of it. The only part of Jimmy that had a little room for movement was his head and neck. His body was held in tight by the restraints. He turned to look at a metal pole that was nearby. This was perhaps his final act of reason. In moments, he began smashing his face and head feverishly into the metal, each hit harder than the last. In the movies, it only takes one really great blow. Not here. The witnesses couldn't believe the horror that they had consented to watching. As the cherry red of his face became distorted by a deeper red and purple, they wondered what it would finally take to put this man out. It really calls into perspective that human life isn't so delicate after all. This man before them was drinking in poison and enduring traumatic brain injury, but still wouldn't go into death. After the blows to his head created what looked like a massacre, yet still continued, all witnesses were hurried out of the room. It was the 8-minute mark. Jimmy wasn't dead. He wasn't even unconscious. Despite it being a right, nobody was allowed to bear witness to his actual death. Later on, prison employees tried to spin a fable to the media. They claimed that Jimmy suffered a fatal heart attack at the 3-minute mark. The witnesses all knew better. There were 0 signs of a fatal heart attack taking form. They knew that he was still moaning, breathing, suffering at 8 minutes. I am sure that the state hoped that the chatter of the truth would all fade away. It didn't. The gas chamber was still used in some states after this horrible occurrence. For some reason, Arizona in particular is especially harsh with putting prisoners to death. They continued using it until 1999, long after other states shelved it. They are even teasing the idea of bringing it back now to replace lethal injection. Unlike the dark hearts of Arizona, some states are looking into a backup plan of lethal gas. Only now they know better than to utilize something as harsh as hydrogen cyanide. In 2015, Oklahoma adopted nitrogen-induced hypoxia as a method on standby. It basically involves forcing the condemned to breathe in only nitrogen until their organs are starved of all oxygen, causing death. This method doesn't cause a sensation of burning alive. It doesn't cause eyes to pop out of their sockets. It basically causes the person to slowly lose coordination, balance, and movement. Clarity eventually fades away. It's nowhere near as harrowing as the previous methods. A couple of other states followed suit, although not a single one has actually used this method to execute someone. They don't appear to have their ducks in a row yet. Much like the electric chair, the gas chamber can also cause a prisoner's eyes to pop out of their sockets. Skin turns pure red and then to purple as the gas invades their system. The lungs' delicate tissue is especially easy prey for the gas's effects, causing them to sear, at first with each gasp and later constantly. Imagine inhaling smoldering embers into your lungs and you might get a close idea of how it would feel. On top of the burning agony, the prisoner is also actively suffocating. You are throwing in the horrors of asphyxiation with similar effects to burning alive. The gas is surrounding them, making it impossible to breathe in anything besides it. You might be thinking to yourself that you would just hold your breath until you pass out. Believe me, people have tried. It's near impossible. Much like drowning to death, there is a breaking point where breathing is no longer a voluntary act. As you keep your mouth shut, the carbon dioxide levels in your blood are rising and oxygen is plummeting. Once the carbon dioxide transcends the oxygen level, your brain will trigger a completely involuntary breath. It is trying to save you. Unfortunately, it doesn't realize that it will actually kill you in this scenario, much like drowning. That point on average typically occurs around the 87-second mark. There are some people who have been able to master this. Divers, for instance, are one of them. They are able to train themselves to hold their breath for what feels like an impossible amount of time. Of course, this isn't a skill that would save them from the gas chamber. It would only prolong the ordeal. Eventually, you will be forced to attempt to breathe, which will welcome the poison into your system. Trying this would also prolong the suffering. All the while that you are trying to hold your breath, the gas is still affecting your eyes and skin. It's also absorbing through it. In short, there is no escaping the gas chamber.
Another very unsettling issue with the gas chamber is that no matter how wrong it goes, there is no way to intervene. Once the process is set in motion, that's it. It isn't safe for anyone to enter the chamber for at least 30 minutes. It's just a done deal. However it goes is how it will go. It is what it is. It's kind of like a mystery prize of executions. Whether the inmate dies in as little as 6 minutes or not for much longer, it just has to play out. After the unforgiving process and the 30-minute lapse time, orderlies enter the chamber in protective gear. They tussle the hair and clothing to release any trapped gas and remove the body. I am sure all of this still happened with Jimmy Lee Gray. We just have no idea how much longer he was truly alive after those first horrifying 8 minutes. We also don't know if anything was done wrong with this execution. We do know that he was missing his head restraint, but we don't know if something happened with the gas, causing death to be delayed. It will likely remain a great mystery of Mississippi. They are clearly uninterested in telling us the truth. I am sure, after all of that, you understand why I believe that this modern method causes the most suffering for the longest. At least with the electric chair, there is a chance that the first jolt will knock the person unconscious. With lethal injection, the first drug might do its job and at the very least render the person into a twilight state. With firing squad, they might hit the target, causing death swiftly. With this, there is no way to end suffering quickly. It takes anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes for the person to die. In the very first gas chamber execution, John faded quickly, but that was due to the level of gas used. That would be too expensive to repeat. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Feel free to drop any requests for execution methods or deaths in my comments.